I will begin with the document itself, because that is how I was trained to begin anything I cannot explain by instinct. The Mutual Survival Compact of the Outer Reach, ratified in the 47th year of the Helvath Provisional Settlement Authority's Colonial Expansion Program, is a bilateral agreement between the HPSA Colonial Directorate and the Earth Outer Reach Expansion Bureau. It was signed in a building I have never visited, by administrators who have been dead for longer than I have been alive. It covers 11 articles. Article 9, subsection 3, paragraph 2, concerns catastrophic infrastructure collapse in signatory colonial installations. The precise language, which I have now read more times than I have read any other document in my administrative career, states the following. In the event of a registered colonial infrastructure emergency, defined as any automated seismic, structural, or thermodynamic cascade failure within a signatory installation, as confirmed by that installation's Class 7 or higher automated monitoring array, the installation's emergency broadcast firmware shall simultaneously transmit on the signatory party's designated emergency band and on the co-response notification frequency registered by the second party at the time of ratification. Receipt by the second party shall be considered automatic triggering of Article 9 mutual response obligations. The second party's nearest rapid response element is required to acknowledge receipt within 4 standard hours and to dispatch within 6. I did not know that paragraph existed. I have now read it 341 times. I am not being dramatic. I kept account. It is the sort of thing a person does when they need to understand exactly how a document that has sat unread in a physical archive for 190 years ended up saving the lives of every person on Cassel Prime. I am Vor Kessel Damath. I have served as Governor Administrator of the Helvath Outer Colony, Cassel Prime Installation, for 11 years. I am submitting this testimony to the Colonial Council at the Council's formal request, as part of the proceeding to determine whether the Mutual Survival Compact of the Outer Reach should be renewed, renegotiated, or formally dissolved. My recommendation is renewal with substantial modernization of its notification protocols. I will explain why. It will take some time. The thermal stabilizer array beneath Cassel Prime's Southern Processing District has been a concern of mine since my 3rd year of tenure. The colony was established on a geologically active site. The settlement planners in the 47th year chose the location for its proximity to 3 navigable shipping lanes, and they were not wrong about that. But they were perhaps optimistic about the long-term stability of the deep-bore anchor columns that keep the thermal extraction system from becoming a thermal catastrophe. The columns are 47 of them, sunk to depths between 800 and 1,200 meters through fractured basalt and a subsurface clay shale interface that, I am told by every engineer who has ever reviewed the site, was not fully characterized before the boring program began. The shale layer moves. Not quickly and not dramatically, but it moves, and over 83 years it had moved enough that the anchor columns in the southern sector were experiencing what Torin Vesh, my engineering lead, described in his 3rd formal assessment to me as progressive differential displacement with nonlinear stress accumulation in the column interfaces. I had submitted 4 formal requests to the Colonial Engineering Branch for a comprehensive structural review of columns 7 through 19. The branch acknowledged each of them. The branch had not yet scheduled a review team at the time the events of this testimony began. I want to be clear about that, and I want to be clear that I am not blaming the branch. The review queue in the outer colonial installations is long, and the inspection teams are not unlimited, and our installation was not alone in waiting for an assessment that had been flagged as important, but not yet categorized as urgent. Torin's assessments used language like progressive and non-linear, but not language like imminent. And imminent is what triggers the branch's expedited scheduling. We were not yet imminent. We were in the longer line. We were managing it. I want to say that clearly. We had monitoring protocols. We had early warning thresholds in the array that would give us enough time to begin an evacuation if the readings crossed into the danger band. Torin had designed those protocols himself, and he was confident in them, and I had no reason not to share that confidence. The protocols were correct, in every way except one, which was that the secondary microfracture in column 7's lower anchor plate was too small and too deep for the array's sensors to detect until it had already propagated beyond the stage where detection would have changed the outcome. Torin has made peace with that. He told me so. I believe him, because Torin is not a person who says things he doesn't mean. And also, because it is the kind of peace that a person either makes or does not make. And living with the alternative is not compatible with continuing to do the work. He has incorporated the microfracture detection gap into every subsequent monitoring protocol he has written for this installation, and he has shared his updated methodology with 7 other colonial engineering teams through the branch's technical exchange program. I mention this because it is part of the record, and because I want the council to understand that the professionals at this installation learned from what happened and applied what they learned. The cascade failure began at the 4th hour past midnight, on the 17th day of the 8th season. I was asleep. My duty officer, a competent young administrator named Seville Hoth, was the first in my office to understand what the monitoring array was reporting. The array is a Class 9 system 2 grades above the threshold specified in Article 9 of the Compact, a fact I did not know at the time and would not have found relevant if I had. Seville's written account of those first minutes is part of this record. She describes the monitoring board going from a standard amber caution state to a full crimson cascade in 11 minutes. Column 9 failed first. Its thermal load dispersed laterally into the basalt layer and produced the ground temperature spike that the array's surface sensors picked up within 40 seconds of the failure. Columns 12 and 14 followed within 3 minutes of each other, in a sequence that Torin later explained was predictable in retrospect, because the stress load that column 9 had been carrying redistributed immediately to its nearest structural neighbors, and 12 and 14 were carrying the highest pre-existing differential displacement in the southern sector. When column 7 began to show the preliminary stress signature that the array's predictive algorithms categorize as imminent structural compromise, Seville activated the planetary emergency beacon. She did this because it is the correct protocol. She did not think carefully about what she was doing. She did it because she had trained for it, and the training said activate the beacon when 2 or more primary columns enter cascade, and a third shows imminent compromise. The training was right. The column threshold exists because 3 simultaneous failures in the southern sector represents a load-bearing transition beyond what the remaining columns were designed to manage alone, and beyond that threshold, the risk of progressive collapse becomes real and rapid. Seville understood this. She pressed the activation panel. The beacon broadcast on the Helvath Colonial Emergency Authority band, which is the band our sector relay monitors and which would, in time, dispatch the Colonial Engineering Response Unit. That is what she intended. What she did not intend, what neither of us knew was happening, was the second transmission. The beacon's firmware was installed from a pre-settlement equipment manifest. That manifest, drawn up in the 46th year of the HPSA's expansion program, was compiled from a standard installation package that had been in use since before the Castle Prime site was chosen. The package predated the Mutual Survival Compact by 1 year. When the compact was ratified, and its Article 9 notification frequency was registered, the standard installation package was updated to include the co-notification encoding, as required by Article 8 of the compact. Every piece of equipment installed from that package on every signatory colony installation for the next 16 years would, when its beacon fired, transmit on both frequencies. The firmware carried the co-notification, encoding the way old walls carry old pipes, present, functional, unexamined, and invisible, until something breaks. The beacon broadcast on both frequencies simultaneously. The Colonial Emergency Authority Band received the signal and logged it at 4 hours and 22 minutes past midnight. The Article 9 co-notification frequency registered by the Earth Outer Reach Expansion Bureau at the time of ratification also received the signal. It received it at 4 hours and 22 minutes past midnight as well, because the speed of light does not distinguish between intended and unintended recipients. Seville woke me at 4 hours and 30 minutes. I was dressed and at the monitoring station by 4 hours and 45. The crimson cascade on the board was something I had run drills for and hoped never to see in practice. And seeing it in practice is a different experience than a drill in the specific way that all things are different when the consequences are real. Torin was already at the engineering console, running load calculations. He had the measured, compressed quality that he gets when the situation is serious, and he has decided that the way to be useful is to become very still and very precise, which is his particular variety of competence, and one I have always found steadying. He was calculating time to breach on column 7, with a focus that I recognized as the kind of focus people develop when they are not letting themselves think about what breach actually means for the people living and working in the Southern District. We had begun the district evacuation at 4 hours and 51 minutes. The district holds approximately 9,000 residents and an additional 2,000 transit workers at peak occupancy. 11,000 people. The evacuation route network for the Southern District uses 3 access corridors: primary west, primary east, and the secondary connector, through the old processing annex. At 5 hours and 3 minutes, Torin's ground sensors reported a secondary ground fracture developing along the fault interface directly beneath the annex connector. By 5 hours and 7 minutes, the fracture had propagated far enough that I took the connector offline as an evacuation route, on the basis that I was not prepared to run 11,000 people through a corridor that sat on top of an active fracture, and that judgment has not changed in the 3 years since I made it. That left 2 access corridors for 11,000 people in the dark. The solar cycle at Cassel Prime runs on a 29-hour rotation, and the 4th hour past midnight is deep in the dark portion. Our emergency lighting systems performed correctly. Our evacuation marshals, 947 volunteers, drawn from the colony's general population, organized and trained by my public safety director, Kesher Voon, over 6 years of quarterly drills performed correctly. I want that on the record. They performed correctly under conditions that were not a drill, with the ground still settling around them, with column 7's failure clock ticking above them on the public display boards that Torin had programmed to show the current breach estimate in real time, because he decided that people moving themselves out of a danger zone have a right to know how much time they have to move. That decision to show the countdown was Torin's, and I supported it, and I believe it was correct. Some administrators in my position might have chosen not to display the number on the grounds that it would cause panic. I have found, in 11 years of managing this installation, that people in genuine danger generally find accurate information less frightening than uncertainty, because accurate information is something they can do something about, and uncertainty is not. The marshals used the display to pace the evacuation. The residents used it to decide how much they could carry. Nobody panicked. They moved. At 6 hours and 14 minutes past midnight, my communications officer, a quiet and methodical man named Ossel Dreven, came to me with an expression that I can only describe as carefully neutral. Ossel is a person who practices careful neutrality, the way some people practice deep breathing. It is his method for not reacting to things until he has decided how he wants to react to them. I have known him for 9 years. He reserves that expression for situations that fall outside the procedural categories he has prepared himself for. He said, "Governor Administrator, I have an acknowledgement on the emergency band. It is not from the Colonial Authority relay." I looked at him. I said, "Who is it from?" He said, "It is from a vessel identifying itself as the ECS Kessler 4, Rapid Response Element, Earth Corridor Sector 8. The acknowledgement references Article 9 of the Mutual Survival Compact of the Outer Reach. It states receipt of our co-notification signal at 4 hours and 23 minutes past midnight. It states that RRE Kessler 4 is currently 6 hours and 41 minutes from our orbital approach at standard burn, and will reduce transit time to 6 hours and 11 minutes on an adjusted burn profile. It states that they are dispatching as required under Article 9 obligations and requests that we confirm our infrastructure emergency type so they can configure their response load appropriately. I stared at him for longer than I should have. I said, "Article 9 of what?" Ossel said, "Governor Administrator, I have accessed the Colonial Archive. I can put the relevant section on your display." I said, "Please do that." What followed was the most disorienting 30 minutes of my administrative career. I had a cascade failure eating through my deep-bore anchor system, 11,000 people moving through 2 functional evacuation corridors in the dark, a secondary fracture that had closed one of my 3 access routes, and Torin telling me every 7 minutes that his breach timeline for Column 7 was narrowing, while simultaneously I was standing at Ossel's communications station, reading a document that had been signed before my grandfather was born, and that apparently obligated an alien species to send us their rapid response element when our emergency beacon fired. I want to be very precise about my emotional state. I was not relieved. I was not grateful. I was not frightened. I was, in a word that I use advisedly, because I believe it is the most accurate one available, bewildered. I did not know what a rapid response element was. I did not know what Earth's response capacity looked like in practical terms. I did not know whether the document I was reading was still legally operative, or whether it had been superseded by subsequent agreements I also hadn't read. I didn't know why our beacon had transmitted on the Article 9 frequency, or what the Article 9 notification frequency was, or how a frequency that nobody in my administration had ever used or been briefed on had apparently been encoded into our emergency firmware without anyone noting that fact in any operational document I had ever received. I sent the confirmation they requested. I described the failure as a Class 7 thermal cascade with structural compromise in progress across 3 primary anchor columns and 1 imminent column failure. I requested clarification on the nature of their response capability. The reply came in 11 minutes. The communications delay at that distance put the exchange on a roughly 22-minute round trip, which meant they had received my confirmation, formulated a reply, and sent it back in just under 22 minutes. The reply was from a person who identified themselves as Senior Response Coordinator Maeve Holst, Earth Corridor Service, Rapid Response Element Kessler 4. It said, in full, Governor Administrator Damath, received and understood. RRE Kessler 4 is currently configured for Type 3 infrastructure emergencies as standard loadout. We are carrying 3 heavy engineering vessels with full deep-bore stabilization and anchor column restoration capability, including Class 14 boring equipment rated for your installation's geology profile. We have reviewed your colony's registered infrastructure specifications in the Article 9 data packet attached to your co-notification signal. That packet was transmitted automatically by your beacon firmware and provides us the technical baseline we need to configure our approach. We are also carrying 2 standard corridor security escorts and 1 full-capacity medical vessel as part of our standard element composition. The medical vessel has 6 surgical suites and accommodation for 200 recovery patients if your evacuation produces casualties, requiring treatment beyond your local medical capacity. We expect orbital insertion at your installation at 10 hours 53 minutes, current day timing. Please advise on your preferred landing zone and current status of your evacuation. I read that message 4 times. Then I handed it to Torin, because I needed someone who understood the engineering implications to read it and tell me whether I was parsing it correctly. Torin read it. He set it down. He looked at the monitoring board for a moment, where Column 7 was now showing the stress profile that his algorithms put at 91 minutes to breach. He said, Class 14 boring equipment, in deep bore stabilization configuration. He said it the way a person says something when they are making sure they have correctly understood a piece of information that they do not want to have misunderstood. He said, "That is the correct equipment for this situation. That is exactly the correct equipment for this situation." D. He paused. He said, "Why do they have our infrastructure specifications?" I said, "Apparently the beacon transmitted them automatically." He looked at me. He said, "When did we agree to that?" I said, 190 years ago apparently. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the monitoring board. He looked at the message again. He said, "Tell them column 7 is our priority. Tell them we need anchor column stabilization before we can even assess columns 12 and 14. I told them. The next 6 hours and 11 minutes were their own particular variety of administrative experience, managing an ongoing evacuation while simultaneously waiting for a response element you did not know existed to arrive from a species with which you had, apparently, a mutual survival compact that nobody in your current administration had read. This is not a situation that any part of my training or prior service prepared me for. I managed the evacuation. I kept Torin informed of the incoming element's configuration and timeline so he could begin planning the technical integration. I briefed Ossel on what to expect from the incoming element's communications protocols, which was difficult because neither of us had ever handled a communications exchange with an Earth response team, and we were both working from the Article 9 document, rather than any operational experience. Ossel, characteristically, was methodical about it. He pulled every reference document in the Colonial archive that mentioned Earth Corridor Service communications protocols. There were 3, all from the early years of the Compact's ratification period, all somewhat out of date. He read them anyway, and he prepared a brief for me, and the brief turned out to be more useful than I expected, because it established the basic channel structure and acknowledgement conventions that the incoming element was using, which made the initial exchanges significantly less uncertain than they would otherwise have been. At 8 hours and 19 minutes past midnight, column 7 failed. This was 26 minutes earlier than Torin's most pessimistic estimate, which he has since explained was the result of the secondary microfracture in the column's lower anchor plate, propagating faster than the array's surface sensors could detect. The breach was partial. The upper section of column 7 separated from its foundation anchor, which relieved approximately 40% of the pressure it had been transmitting to the surrounding geology, but simultaneously created a subsidence event in the surface layer above the column's footprint. The southern processing district's western edge dropped by approximately 2 meters over an area of 400 square meters. 3 structures collapsed. 1 was unoccupied. 2 were not. Our casualty teams were already staged at the evacuation perimeter. They went in within 4 minutes. I will not describe that part in more detail than this. They did their work, and the people who came out because of them. And the people who did not come out because the buildings fell faster than anyone could have prevented. RRE Kessler 4 reached our orbital approach at 10 hours and 49 minutes, 4 minutes ahead of their revised estimate. I was at the communications station. Ossel had the channel open. I watched the approach track on our orbital display, and I tried to count the vessel icons, and I got to 4 before the display refreshed and showed me 6. 6 vessels. 3 heavy engineering ships in a configuration I had never seen before, longer than anything in our colonial fleet, with what I later learned were deep-bore equipment carriages along their lower hulls, retracted for transit. 2 sleeker vessels, flanking them in a loose escort configuration, and a 6th vessel that was distinct from all the others by its profile, broader, slower in the approach curve, with a distinctive docking array along its port side that Ossel identified from the data packet before I could ask. The medical vessel, Senior Response Coordinator Holst, was on the channel within 3 minutes of orbital insertion. She had, she told me, reviewed the updated situation report I had transmitted during the transit. She understood that column 7 had failed, that there were casualties, and that the evacuation of the southern district was still in progress. She asked for permission to begin atmospheric entry and set down her engineering vessels adjacent to the Column 7 failure site. She asked whether she should coordinate her medical vessel directly with my colonial medical lead or route that through me. Her voice was even. It was not the evenness of someone performing calm for the benefit of a frightened audience. It was the evenness of someone to whom this kind of situation was within the range of ordinary professional activity, serious, requiring full attention, worth every hour of the preparation that had gone into being ready for it, but not beyond the capability of the people and equipment assembled to address it. That quality, in that moment, was the most valuable thing anyone communicated to me during the entire event. Not the Class 14 boring equipment, not the 6 surgical suites. The voice of someone who had prepared for this and was not surprised by it. I gave her permission. I gave her my medical lead's direct channel. I told her that Torin would be at the Column 7 site and would serve as their on-ground technical liaison. She said, "Understood, Governor Administrator. We'll be on the ground in 18 minutes. They were on the ground in 16. What Torin describes in his report as the most remarkable aspect of the response. He uses the word remarkable with a precision that I have come to understand means something between professionally impressive and personally unsettling was the speed of the technical integration. The 3 heavy engineering vessels carried crews who, according to their own records, had conducted anchor column stabilization operations on 8 previous occasions in their service careers, though not, Torin notes carefully, on installations of Helvath colonial design. The design difference required a 6-hour technical exchange between the Earth engineering crews and Torin's team before the first bore could be initiated. Torin describes those 6 hours as the most intensive, professional conversation of his life. He also notes, in a passage I have read more than once, that the Earth crew's lead bore engineer, a woman named Cadris, who communicated through a translation system that added roughly 2 seconds to every exchange, identified a secondary stress propagation path in the Column 9 failure site that Torin's own team had not detected, and that identifying it 3 hours before the bore program began was the difference between a stabilization that held and one that would have failed within the first 72 hours. He says she pointed at the stress map and said 4 words. Torin speaks some Earth Standard language, not fluently, but enough to understand 4 words without the translation delay. The 4 words were, "This will go next." He looked at the map. He understood she was right. He said, "Yes." She nodded once and moved on to the next problem. I was not at the Column 7 site during the bore operation. My role during those 48 hours was coordination, evacuation management, liaison with the Colonial Authority relay that had dispatched its own response unit, management of the displaced population, and the administrative fact that none of my standard operational procedures had anticipated the presence of 6 Earth vessels, 112 Earth crew members, and a Class 14 deep bore program conducted simultaneously by 2 alien engineering teams who spoke different languages and had never met each other before, the moment their equipment was staged side by side at the Column 7 breach site. I was also, during the quieter hours between the status reports, reading the Mutual Survival Compact of the Outer Reach in its entirety. Not just Article 9. The whole document. It is not a long document. 11 articles, 16 pages in its original form, in the formal administrative register of the HPSA's 47th year, which is slightly different from the administrative register I use today, but close enough that the meaning is always clear. I read it the way I read documents that I am going to have to explain to other people carefully, more than once, with an eye for the parts that are going to require careful explanation, and for the parts that, if someone in this administration had read them at some point in the last 190 years, might have changed how we manage this installation. Article 1 establishes the mutual recognition of both parties as sovereign administrative entities with colonial settlement programs in overlapping spatial regions. Article 6 establishes the pre-positioning requirement for rapid response elements. the requirement that the second party maintain an element within a specified operational radius of the highest risk installations in the reading. Compact's coverage zone. I spent considerable time on Article 6. The specification in Article 6 is precise. The operational radius is defined as the maximum transit time to reach the highest risk installation in the coverage zone, assuming a standard burn profile, in under 8 hours. Earth had positioned RRE Kessler 4 to be within that radius. They had been maintaining that position for 31 years. Article 6 required them to, and they had read Article 6. Article 8 is the one that established the co-notification frequency. The language is unambiguous. The encoding requirement for installation firmware is detailed in Article 8's technical annex, which is attached to the main document and which contains the specific firmware specifications that were incorporated into the standard installation package update. Reading Article 8's technical annex, I can trace the exact path from the compact's ratification to the firmware in our beacon to the co-notification signal that reached RRE Kessler 4 at 4 hours and 23 minutes past midnight. Every step is documented. Every step was correct. The only step that was not taken was the step of telling anyone in this administration that the path existed. Article 9, 3 pages. The article whose existence neither I nor anyone in my current administration had known about until Ossel read me the acknowledgement contains. In subsection 2, the direct contact provision that Coordinator Holst would later mention to me. Any signatory installation may contact the Article 9 co-notification frequency directly at any point during a qualifying emergency, not only upon beacon activation. The frequency is listed. If I had known that frequency, and if I had known I was permitted to use it, I could have contacted RRE Kessler 4 when Column 7 entered early stage stress signature 4 hours before it failed. They could have been on the ground before the breach. 3 structures might still have stood. I read that paragraph once, and then set the document down, and looked at the monitoring station where Ossel was managing the overnight status report exchange with the Earth element, and I thought about what I was going to do with that information. I could not undo what had happened. I could not unknow what I now knew. And I could not know it without understanding what it meant for every administrator who would come after me in this position. What I could do was write it into the operational record in a way that made certain no one who served in this office after me would find themselves in the position I had been in discovering, at the worst possible time, that they had a resource they didn't know they had. The Bohr program ran for 40 hours. The Column 7 breach was sealed at the foundation level, and the upper section re-anchored with a temporary load-bearing lattice that will hold until a permanent reconstruction can be completed. Column 9 was stabilized through the secondary stress path that Cadris identified, with 2 additional bore points that Torin and the Earth crew designed jointly over an 8-hour overnight session that Torin describes in his report as one of the most technically productive he has participated in. Columns 12 and 14 were assessed and found to be an early-stage deterioration rather than active cascade. The columns 7 and 9 failures had, counterintuitively, relieved enough distributed pressure on the system that 12 and 14 had been spared the cascade progression. They will require a full structural replacement program within 4 years. The medical vessel treated 43 patients from the subsidence event. 11 of those required surgical intervention. All 11 survived. The medical lead from the Earth vessel, a surgeon named Deva Oshun, worked alongside my colonial medical staff for 9 days. My chief medical officer, Para Nell, submitted a separate report to the council as part of this proceeding, and her conclusions are consistent with my own administrative assessment of the Earth medical response. Thorough, competent, and conducted with a complete absence of the institutional distance that sometimes makes interagency medical cooperation difficult. On the 14th day, Coordinator Holst requested a formal handoff meeting. I met her at the temporary operations center that the engineering vessels had established adjacent to the Bohr sites. She wore the Earth Corridor Service uniform with the Rapid Response Element designation on the sleeve, and she shook my hand in the Earth fashion, which I had practiced because Ossel had told me it would be expected. We sat at a folding table in a room that smelled like Bohr lubricant and strong beverage. And she walked me through the handoff documentation, and I signed the operational transfer forms. And at the end of that process, she asked me if I had any questions. I had many questions. I asked the one that I had been turning over the longest. I said, I want to understand the notification sequence. When our beacon fired, the Article 9 co-notification signal was transmitted automatically by the firmware. Your element received it within minutes. You acknowledged within 4 hours and dispatched within 6. The Colonial Authority relay received our primary signal and dispatched their response unit, which arrived 22 hours after you. You were closer, but not by a margin that explains a 22-hour difference. How is it that your response was that much faster? She said. The Article 9 framework includes a pre-positioned element requirement. RRE Kessler 4 is positioned in Corridor Sector 8 specifically because this compact's colonial coverage area sits within our operational radius. We are stationed at a point that keeps us within a 6 to 8 hour burn of the highest risk installations in the compact's coverage zone. Your Colonial Authority relay has a different deployment framework. Their response elements cover a much larger area with fewer pre-positioned assets. They do good work. They were just further away. I said, you positioned a rapid response element to serve an obligation that had never been invoked in 31 years. She said, the obligation existed. The compact is signed. The position requirement is in Article 6. She paused. We read Article 6. I absorbed that. I said, we did not read Article 6. She said, no. She said it without emphasis. It was not a criticism. It was a statement of a fact that we both already understood. I asked one more question. I said, if we had known about this compact, if we had been aware of it, and of the notification frequency, and of the Article 9 framework, would anything have been different? She considered that seriously. She said, the beacon would still have fired on both frequencies. The co-notification would still have reached us. We would still have dispatched. She paused. You might have called us directly, before the beacon fired, when the cascade was still in early stage. That would have given us another 3 or 4 hours of transit time. Column 7 might not have failed before we arrived. I thought about the 3 structures. I said, I see. She said, the compact provides for direct contact on the Article 9 co-notification frequency at any point during a qualifying emergency, not only upon beacon activation. That's in Article 9, subsection 2. I said, I will read Article 9, subsection 2. She said, I know. RRE Kessler 4 departed our orbital space on the 19th day. I watched the departure track from the monitoring station where Ossel had read me the acknowledgement 19 days before, and I watched the 6 vessel icons move from orbital approach into transit configuration and begin the long burn back toward Corridor Sector 8, where they would resume their station and resume the 31-year-old habit of being ready for an obligation that they had now, once, been called to fulfill. The Colonial Authority's engineering team remained for another 6 days to complete the secondary assessment work on columns 12 and 14. I worked well with them. They were competent and thorough, and they arrived as quickly as their deployment framework allowed. I have been asked by the Council to provide my personal recommendation regarding the compact's future. I will provide it plainly. The Mutual Survival Compact of the Outer Reach should be renewed. It should not be allowed to lapse or be treated as a relic of administrative history that no longer has operational relevance. It has operational relevance. I know this because it operated. The compact should be modernized in 3 specific ways. First, every colonial installation within its coverage zone should receive a formal administrative notification of the compact's existence, its terms, its communication frequencies, and its operational procedures. This notification should not be embedded in equipment firmware or archived in physical records that administrators may not know to look for. It should be a living administrative document, current and accessible, the same way that evacuation protocols and engineering maintenance schedules are current and accessible. The fact that this installation was covered by an Article 9 obligation for 190 years without any administrator in that period being aware of it is not a testament to the compact's durability. It is an administrative failure, and I accept my share of responsibility for it. Second, the direct contact provision in Article 9, subsection 2, should be specifically highlighted in that notification, because it is the provision that would have made the most practical difference in our specific emergency. The beacon firmware cannot be replaced everywhere in the coverage zone overnight, but direct contact can be initiated immediately, today, by any administrator who knows the frequency exists. Third, I recommend a formal review of which elements of the compact's original infrastructure, data packet transmission, the automatic attachment of a colony's registered specifications to its beacon signal remain accurate for each installation in the coverage zone. Our installation's data packet was current. Coordinator Holst told me it was sufficient for their engineering pre-configuration, but other installations within the coverage zone have been modified, expanded, or partially rebuilt in the years since their registration data was submitted. And a response element configured on outdated specifications is a response element that arrives less prepared than it could be. These are not radical changes. They are administrative maintenance. The compact itself, its obligations, and the framework that sends a rapid response element to an installation that fires an Article 9 signal, that framework does not need to change. It worked. It worked because the other party to the compact read it, understood it, and spent 31 years preparing to fulfill it, without any invoice and without any guarantee that they would ever be called. I did not ask for that. I did not know I had it. I did not know the beacon would call it due, but it was there. The obligation was there, encoded in firmware that nobody in this administration had examined, sitting in an archive that nobody in this administration had opened. And when the firmware transmitted on the frequency that nobody in my administration knew was encoded in it, 6 vessels were already positioned to answer, because 31 years earlier, someone on the other side of the compact had read Article 6 and done what Article 6 required. Coordinator Holst, on her last day at the operations center, asked me if there was anything else she could help clarify before the element departed. I told her that I thought I understood the situation now and that I had no outstanding questions. She said, "The compact works better when both parties know it exists." I said, "Yes, I am aware of that now." She said, "We'll be at our station if you need us." I said, "I know where to reach you." She nodded once and left. I have included the full text of the Mutual Survival Compact of the Outer Reach as Appendix A to this testimony. I have also included the Article 9 co-notification frequency as a standing entry in this installation's emergency communications register, where it will remain for as long as I am Governor Administrator of Castle Prime, and where it will, I trust, be read by whoever holds this position after me. The beacon called the obligation due. The obligation answered. I intend to make sure that the next time Castle Prime needs to call that frequency, whoever is standing at the communication station will know what they are calling and why, and will not spend 30 bewildering minutes reading a document that should have been in their operational briefing from their first day in this office. That is my testimony. That is my recommendation. I have nothing further to add. Addendum to testimony submitted at the Council's request, 14 days after the primary testimony above was filed. The Council has asked me to expand on one passage in my primary testimony that several members found insufficiently detailed. The passage concerns the 6 hours and 11 minutes between my sending the confirmation to RRE Kessler 4 and the element's orbital insertion. I describe those hours as their own particular variety of administrative experience. The Council has asked me to be more specific. I will try. At 6 hours and 20 minutes past midnight, 6 minutes after I had sent our emergency type confirmation and request for clarification, I had two conversations that ran in parallel, and which I am now going to describe in sequence, because the record requires it, even though in the actual moment they were layered on top of each other, with the usual messiness of simultaneous crises. The first conversation was with Torin. He had reviewed the engineering specifications in the Article 9 data packet that my confirmation to Holst had referenced the packet. I had learned from Article 8, contained our colony's registered infrastructure baseline, and Torin wanted to know exactly what they were working from. He accessed the packet from the archive and compared it to our current infrastructure survey. The comparison took him 4 minutes. He came to me with his tablet, and the expression he gets when he has found something that is both useful and annoying. He said, "Their specifications match our installation plan as of the 63rd year of the colonial program." That's 83 years ago. But the anchor column layout in the southern sector was partially reconfigured in year 71, which means their baseline shows 47 columns, and the current installation has 43 columns in the active configuration, plus 4 decommissioned stubs that they might misidentify as load-bearing. I said, "Can you prepare a correction document?" He said, "I already have. I'll transmit it with your next status update." He had already drafted the correction before he came to me to report the discrepancy. This is characteristic of Torin, and one of the reasons I value him. The second conversation was with Keshar Voon, my public safety director, who was managing the evacuation from a mobile station at the Primary West Corridor Junction. The conversation was not long. She told me that Primary West was processing at 92% of its calculated capacity, which was good. She told me that Primary East was at 87%, which was also acceptable. She told me that the Column 7 failure clock was visible on the public boards throughout the evacuation routes, which she had confirmed with the people nearest to her, was in fact helping people pace themselves rather than creating disorder. She said, "They can see the number. They're moving at the number. The ones who are moving faster than the number are helping the ones who are moving slower." She said it in the flat, descriptive register of a person who had trained for this, and was reporting what she observed rather than what she hoped to observe. And it was one of the more accurate and useful situation reports I received that night. Then she told me that she had approximately 2,300 people still in the evacuation zone as of that moment, and that her estimate was that they would clear the zone within 110 minutes if current throughput held. Column 7's breach clock was at 91 minutes. I told her to hold the throughput and to inform her leading marshals of the breach clock. She said, "They know the breach clock. They've been watching it since I posted it." I told her I understood and ended the channel. At 7 hours past midnight, I received the engineering specifications correction that Torin had transmitted to Holst's element, along with its acknowledgement. The acknowledgement was from the lead bore engineer Cadris, and not from Holst. It was 7 words. Received. Noted. Column stubs flagged as inactive. 7 words, 12 minutes, round trip at the communications delay, and the primary technical risk from the outdated data packet was addressed. I have thought about those 7 words more than they probably merit. They were the first direct communication I received from anyone other than Holst on the incoming element, and they communicated something beyond their content. Someone on that element was actively engaged with the technical preparation, working through what we had sent them, and already past the documentation stage into the engineering stage, while they were still 6 hours out. I had not expected that. I do not know exactly what I had expected, but I do not think I had expected to receive a bore engineering correction acknowledgement with a flagging note before the element had even begun atmospheric entry. At 7 hours and 40 minutes, Column 7's breach clock dropped below 30 minutes. I transmitted a priority update to Holst's element with the revised timeline. The acknowledgement came in 22 minutes. Understood. Adjusting entry sequence to prioritize heavy engineering lead vessel for Column 7. Immediate response. ETA to Column 7's site estimated at 11 hours 15 minutes from your current timestamp, assuming atmospheric clearance on approach. I ran the arithmetic. 11 hours and 15 minutes from that moment was after the Column 7 breach. The column was going to fail before they arrived at the site. I transmitted that to Torin. He already knew. He had been running the same arithmetic. He said, from the engineering console without looking up, the element will be in orbit before the column fails. They won't be on the ground. That's the situation. He paused. We seal the western approach boundary. We stage the casualty response teams at the perimeter, and we wait for the column to do what the column is going to do. That's the job. He was right. That was the job. We did the job. Column 7 failed at 8 hours and 19 minutes. What followed is in the primary testimony above, and also in Torin's engineering report, and also in Paranel's medical report, and I have nothing to add to those accounts. The Council has all 3 documents. What I will add, because the Council asked me to describe those 6 hours more specifically, is this. At some point during the 2nd hour of the wait, Ossel came to me with a printed copy of the co-notification acknowledgement that RRE Kessler 4 had sent at 4 hours and 22 minutes. He had printed it because he found the paper version easier to annotate than the display version, and he had annotated it extensively. The annotations were questions, and reference citations cross-references to the compact articles, questions about communication protocol that the 3 archived documents on Earth corridor service procedures hadn't fully answered, notes on the element's configuration that he intended to research further. He set it on the station next to me without a word, and went back to his console. I looked at it. The acknowledgement was 7 lines. Ossel's annotations covered another 2 pages attached to it. I have thought about this often since. We were in the middle of a serious infrastructure emergency, with 11,000 people in 2 evacuation corridors and a breach clock in the final minutes, and my communications officer was doing what he had always done, preparing, researching, making sure that when the moment came to use a capability he had not previously known about, he would be ready to use it correctly. The annotated acknowledgement is part of my personal archive now. It is not, strictly speaking, an official record, but it is, I think, an accurate representation of how this installation actually functioned that night, which was, correctly, under conditions that none of us had prepared for, because the people here were the kind of people who prepare even when they don't know what they're preparing for. The Council asked me to describe the 6 hours. That is my description. The element came. The column fell before they landed. The element did the work. The colony survived. I have not found a way to say it that is shorter than this, and also true. I have nothing further to add to the addendum.